The creaking sounds finally stopped. On this heavy night, low, husky voices gradually calmed down. A subtle rustling sound of fabric could be heard as the man got up. Putting on his clothes. Stella Seeley looked at the scratch marks on his back. She felt a sudden impulse, and reflexively grabbed his wrist. Could you stay here tonight? Weston paused. Without turning back and letting her keep the view of his perfectly toned back, he buttoned up his shirt. Stella was anxious. Her fingers clenched at the already wrinkled sheets, further crumpling them. She held her breath as if to wait for his judgment. After a long while, she heard him say, "Okay." Stella breathed a sigh of relief. She even felt tears well up in her eyes. The man turned around. He was strikingly tall and had chiseled handsome features, and his deep eyes looked like the starry night sky. This man was her husband, Weston Ford. Sole heir of Ford Corporation, he was the youngest man to ever top the Fortune's list, and the most prestigious businessman around the globe. He was also a frequent guest at major banquets and events. A man as perfect as him belonged to her. Stella straightened up and looked him carefully in the eyes. "Can I help you change into a set of sleepwear?" She slowly touched his shirt collar, trying to probe for his permission. Weston's eyes darkened, but he didn't stop her. Although he seemed somewhat reluctant, he allowed her to unbutton his shirt. Stella quietly breathed a sigh of relief, feeling bittersweet on the inside. During their marriage, Weston was undoubtedly the perfect husband. He was wealthy and prestigious. When it came to his wife, he was considerate and respectful. Sometimes Stella wondered why he was interested in her in the first place. Only she didn't have time to ponder this problem, because she needed money badly, and this man was her only support. Weston was her only pillar. So even if they were husband and wife, she was still careful around him and tried to gain his favor. However, Weston was good enough to her. He gave her the dignity of being his wife. Even if she was so average that she would be easily lost in a crowd, her identity as Mrs. Ford had given her space to breathe in this real world. Aside from the fact that he never spent the night with her, everything was great. It was exceptionally quiet tonight. This was the first time Weston was sleeping beside her, and he slept soundly, but Stella couldn't sleep. She kept wanting to reach out to touch his face. The man frowned and turned over to have his back face her. Her hand stopped midair. A moment later, she bitterly retracted her hand and closed her eyes to sleep. The next morning, Stella woke up very early to make Weston breakfast. She drew her hair up in a high ponytail, revealing her fair neck. Weston was greeted by such a sight when he woke up and entered the kitchen. Stella turned around upon hearing the sounds and smiled at him. "You're up." Weston grunted in reply. "I made you breakfast. It'll be ready soon. Can you wait for me in the living room?" "Okay." Stella worked faster. In the living room, without anything to talk about, they ate their breakfast in silence. She had always been skillful in cooking. As she watched Weston slowly finish up the breakfast she prepared, she smiled in satisfaction. Weston had a great upbringing. He was dignified, elegant, and a sight to see even when he was eating. After he put down his cutlery, he glanced at her and said, "There's something I want to tell you." "What is it?" Stella was about to clear the plates but paused and stood beside the table to look at him. The man's defined and slender finger tapped on the table briefly before handing her a document, a divorce agreement. Divorce? Stella couldn't describe how she felt when she saw the divorce agreement. She sat down and squeezed her hands at the hems of her shirt. "Why?" She looked up, finally staring him straight in the eyes. She had never looked at him directly before, even when they were making love last night. There was always an imposing distance and iciness in his cold but charming eyes. Like an everlasting iceberg, no one could ever gain his pity or love. Just like the staff in his company, Stella was afraid of looking him in the eyes. However, divorce was a major issue. She wanted to know why he had suddenly decided to do this. Even if she didn't have the right to refuse, he could at least give her a reason. "There's no reason." There was no emotion in his tone. He got up slowly and swept a glance at her, exuding an oppressing aura. "Sign it after you've read through it." Stella's gaze fell to the divorce agreement. Instead of taking it, she hung her head, looking rather pale. There was a momentary silence in the air. Weston looked at her ghastly pale face, but still, she refused to speak up. He was then reminded of last night that he had gripped her with overwhelming force, and it was obvious that she felt uncomfortable. But her fingers had clenched onto the sheets tightly instead, despite looking so pale. She never made a sound even when she almost tore the sheets. They didn't close the windows, but the curtains were drawn. When a breeze fluttered the curtains and moonlight spilled over Stella's body, Weston wasn't sure if the moonlight was too pale, or if Stella was just too weakened. With this in mind, his gaze mellowed and his forehead relaxed. "I will give you some time to get used to this. You can keep staying here for the time being." Even after the man had left, Stella was still shrunk back into her chair. She hugged her knees and stared at the divorce agreement. Her eyes felt wide at least he was willing to give her some time to let this reality sink in. It was merciful enough for an aloof man like him to not chase her out immediately. So should she feel content instead? At the hospital, Stella didn't have time to stay upset. Roger Seeley was in the midst of undergoing treatment. Stella stood outside his ward and watched the frail young man lying there. She felt hints of being exhausted, bitter, and slightly afraid. She held up her phone and pondered for a moment before calling Weston. Perhaps the divorce had given her determination and courage. She wanted Weston to keep her company since he was still her husband for now. Would he do it? The busy tone was her answer. Stella leaned against the ice-cold wall helplessly. A silhouette strode past her. and an indignant female voice bellowed, "Weston Ford, I'm at the hospital now. If you don't want anything to happen to the child in my stomach, come and see me now." Stella immediately straightened up. She thought she had heard it wrong. Weston Ford. Her mind had been a swirl of emotions, so she didn't hear anything else but the name clearly. Was it her husband, the Weston Ford? Stella looked up and immediately recognized the woman to be the recently popular celebrity, Gwen. Stella listened to the woman's capricious tone. Her fists clenched slightly and bitterness filled her heart.